Cheryl Ladd finally breaks her silence on her feud with Kate Jackson, and it forces a question many fans have quietly carried for decades. Why speak now, after all this time has passed? For years their names have been linked by Charlie's Angels, a show that promised unity, confidence, and shared strength. Yet behind the smiles and studio lights, something never quite aligned. Viewers saw three women standing together, but the reality between two of them was far more complicated. When Ladd arrived in 1977, she entered a world already strained by sudden fame, shifting power, and unresolved frustration. She replaced a cultural phenomenon, joined a cast under pressure, and worked beside a woman who had helped define the show from the very beginning. What followed was not open conflict, but a silence that spoke volumes. Decades later, that silence feels heavier than ever, raising the question of what changed and why this story still refuses to fade. Before Cheryl Ladd ever stepped onto the set, Charlie's Angels was already carrying weight few viewers could see. When the series premiered on September 22, 1976, it arrived as something rare for its time, a prime-time drama led entirely by women, framed as intelligent, capable, and visually polished. Kate Jackson stood at the center of that vision. As Sabrina Duncan, she was not only an original angel, she was widely viewed as the anchor, the one who approached the work with seriousness and intention rather than novelty. From the beginning, Jackson treated the show as more than entertainment. She had come from a background rooted in acting discipline, and she cared deeply about how women were portrayed on screen. Early episodes leaned into mystery and problem-solving, giving her character authority and purpose. For Jackson, this was not just a job, it was a statement, and she guarded it closely. Then the balance shifted. Farrah Fawcett's sudden rise turned the series into a cultural phenomenon almost overnight. Her image traveled faster than the show itself, appearing on posters, magazine covers, and bedroom walls across the country. While that fame brought attention, it also changed how the show was perceived. What began as a detective series increasingly became a spectacle, and that shift mattered deeply to Kate Jackson. By the end of the first season, Farrah Fawcett chose to leave the show. Her departure was public, abrupt, and disruptive. For the production, it meant scrambling to keep the series alive. For Jackson, it marked the loss of a carefully built dynamic and introduced uncertainty about the show's direction. The foundation she had helped lay no longer felt stable. Behind the scenes, Jackson's dissatisfaction grew. She later spoke openly about her frustration with the scripts, explaining that the stories were becoming lighter and less grounded, moving away from the kind of work she believed the show promised at the start. This dissatisfaction was not quiet, and it was not hidden. It became part of the show's internal atmosphere, shaping the tone long before a replacement angel was even cast. By the time producers searched for someone new, the environment was already tense. Expectations were high, pressure was constant, and trust was fragile. The show needed saving, yet it also needed to evolve, and those two goals did not always align. For someone like Kate Jackson, who had invested emotionally and creatively, change did not feel neutral, it felt personal. This matters because it explains what Cheryl Ladd walked into. When she was cast in 1977 as Kris Munroe, she was not entering a harmonious workplace waiting to welcome her. She was stepping into a production shaped by loss, resentment, and unresolved disagreement about what Charlie's Angels was supposed to be. The tension did not begin with her arrival, and it did not originate from her presence. Jackson's role as an original angel carried authority, whether spoken or not. She had history with the producers, influence on set, and a clear vision for the show. Any change introduced at that stage would have felt intrusive, no matter how talented or well-intentioned the newcomer might have been. The stage was set for distance long before the cameras rolled on season 2. What audiences never saw was how much of the story had already been written before Cheryl Ladd arrived. The discomfort, the frustration, and the sense of something slipping away were already there, shaping reactions that would later be misunderstood as personal and with that unresolved tension lingering in the background, the arrival of a new angel was never going to be simple. Cheryl Ladd's entrance into Charlie's Angels in 1977 was framed publicly as a smooth transition, but the reality carried far more weight than the press releases suggested. She was introduced as Kris Munroe, the younger sister of Farrah Fawcett's Jill, a creative choice meant to reassure viewers that nothing essential had been lost. On paper, it was clever. Emotionally, it placed Ladd in an impossible position, asked to honor a legacy while never appearing to replace it. From the start, Ladd understood the scrutiny. The audience was watching closely, critics were skeptical, and the show's future depended on whether viewers would accept a new angel. She stepped into the role with professionalism, determination, and a clear understanding of what was at stake. The show survived, ratings remained strong, and Kris Munroe quickly became familiar to millions of households. From the outside, the transition appeared successful. Inside the production, however, acceptance was not universal. Kate Jackson had already voiced her dissatisfaction with the direction of the series, and Ladd's arrival became another visible symbol of a show drifting further from its original identity. Ladd did not create that frustration, but she arrived carrying it, whether she wanted to or not. For Jackson, the changes unfolding around her were cumulative, and each adjustment seemed to confirm that the series she helped build was slipping away. The two women worked together through seasons 2 and 3, sharing scenes, storylines, and the public image of unity the show depended on. Yet multiple entertainment records and long-standing television histories note that the relationship never warmed. They were professional, capable, and courteous on camera, but behind the scenes there was distance. Cheryl Ladd would later describe Kate Jackson as never all that friendly, a careful choice of words that spoke volumes without escalating conflict. This was not a set filled with shouting or visible confrontation. Instead, it was defined by absence, by conversations that never happened, and by a lack of connection that quietly shaped the atmosphere. Ladd was the newcomer, conscious of stepping into someone else's territory, while Jackson was the original angel, watching her influence diminish as the show evolved. Neither role left much room for ease. Reports from the period describe Jackson avoiding promotional activities involving Ladd, reinforcing the sense of separation. Whether intentional or instinctive, that distance became noticeable over time. Public appearances, photo sessions, and press moments that might have fostered familiarity instead highlighted how little overlap existed between them. To fans, it was subtle. To those on set, it was unmistakable. For Ladd, the experience carried emotional complexity. She was succeeding professionally, embraced by audiences, and securing her place on a hit series, yet she remained aware that something fundamental was missing. Acceptance from viewers did not automatically translate into acceptance from everyone around her. She carried the responsibility of helping the show continue, even as she sensed she had entered during a period of unresolved strain. What makes this moment enduring is how restrained both women remained. No public accusations surfaced. No interviews erupted into controversy. The story unfolded quietly, through tone, behavior, and years of retrospective acknowledgement, rather than dramatic confession. That restraint preserved professionalism, but it also allowed speculation to grow unchecked. By the time Season 3 came to an end, the dynamic between Cheryl Ladd and Kate Jackson had settled into a pattern that never truly shifted. They worked together, fulfilled their roles, and maintained the image required of them. But the emotional distance remained intact. The silence that formed during those years would follow both women long after the cameras stopped rolling, becoming part of Charlie's Angels' history, in a way no script ever addressed. As the series continued, the distance between Cheryl Ladd and Kate Jackson stopped feeling temporary and began to feel structural. It was no longer something that might change with time or familiarity. Instead, it became part of how the show functioned behind the scenes, an unspoken boundary that shaped interactions without ever being acknowledged aloud. What defined their relationship was not hostility, but separation. Industry records and long-standing television accounts consistently describe two women who fulfilled their professional responsibilities without forging a personal connection. They appeared together when the work required it, then moved in different directions once the cameras stopped. That pattern repeated often enough that it became noticeable, even if no one ever explained it publicly. Promotional appearances reflected the same divide. Reports from the period indicate that joint publicity moments were limited, and when they did occur, they felt formal rather than familiar. For a show built on the image of unity, that lack of ease mattered. Viewers may not have known why, but they sensed something was missing, a subtle absence that no script could disguise. Years later, Cheryl Ladd addressed this dynamic with care. Her comment that Kate Jackson was never all that friendly remains one of the few moments where the silence was acknowledged directly. The statement did not reopen old wounds or assign blame. It simply named a reality that had existed without commentary for decades. In its simplicity, it carried more weight than any dramatic accusation could have. Kate Jackson, for her part, spoke far more openly about her dissatisfaction with the series itself. She criticized the direction of the scripts, expressing disappointment that the show had shifted toward lighter stories and visual appeal at the expense of substance. Her concerns were documented and consistent, rooted in creative frustration rather than personal grievance. Still, the overlap between her growing discontent and Ladd's arrival was impossible to ignore. This is where context becomes essential. Jackson's frustration did not originate with Ladd, but Ladd became a visible reminder of how much the show had changed. She represented continuity for the audience and survival for the production, yet symbolized loss for someone who had helped define the original vision. That imbalance created emotional distance without requiring confrontation. The absence of conflict did not mean the absence of impact. Without direct communication, misunderstandings had no opportunity to dissolve. Without acknowledgement, tension had nowhere to go. The result was a working environment defined by restraint, where professionalism replaced warmth and silence replaced resolution. Over time, that silence took on a life of its own. Fans noticed, commentators speculated, retrospectives searched for explanations. Yet the women themselves continued to withhold dramatic commentary, allowing the narrative to grow louder precisely because they refused to feed it. What might have faded instead hardened into lore. There is also something quietly revealing in how long this silence endured. Neither woman attempted to rewrite the story while the show was still airing. Neither used interviews to correct assumptions or air grievances. That restraint suggests not avoidance but control. A deliberate choice to protect their work and their reputations, even at the cost of personal clarity. By the time the series approached another turning point, the distance between Cheryl Ladd and Kate Jackson was no longer evolving. It had settled. It no longer asked to be resolved. It simply existed, shaping memory more than moments, and ensuring that what was never said would ultimately become the most enduring part of their shared history. Kate Jackson's departure from Charlie's Angels around 1979 marked a visible change for the series, but it did not bring the emotional clarity many might expect. When she stepped away, the decision was publicly connected to her dissatisfaction with the show's direction, a concern she had voiced repeatedly and without ambiguity. The scripts no longer reflected what she believed the series had promised, and the creative compromises had become too heavy to ignore. For the audience, Jackson's exit felt like the end of an era. She had been there from the beginning, shaping the tone, the intelligence, and the authority that defined the early seasons. Her absence altered the balance on screen, leaving behind a version of the show that looked familiar but felt different. What disappeared with her was not just a character but a certain gravity that had grounded the series. For Cheryl Ladd, the departure carried a different weight. She remained, continuing her role as Kris Munroe while the show adjusted around her. Professionally, it meant stability and ongoing success. Emotionally, it meant that the distance between her and Jackson would never be addressed directly. The opportunity for conversation, clarification, or closure quietly disappeared along with Jackson's final episode. The silence that had defined their relationship did not end when Jaclyn left. Instead, it followed both women forward. Without a final reckoning, the story remained unfinished, open to interpretation, and shaped largely by what viewers imagined rather than what was ever confirmed. The absence of resolution allowed the narrative to drift, transforming professional tension into something far more mythic over time. As Charlie's Angels continued through its final seasons, the show leaned further into spectacle and familiarity. New cast members came and went. The format evolved. By the time the series concluded in 1981, it had become a different entity from the one that premiered 5 years earlier. The original promise of the show existed mostly in memory, preserved through reruns and nostalgia rather than ongoing creative intent. Jaclyn, meanwhile, moved on to other projects, carrying with her a reputation for seriousness and creative conviction. Her critiques of Charlie's Angels followed her, shaping how her departure was understood. She was seen as someone unwilling to compromise, a performer who cared deeply about substance in an industry increasingly drawn to surface appeal. That reputation, fair or not, became part of her legacy. Cheryl Ladd's path diverged. She became, for many viewers, the enduring face of the later seasons, associated with the show's longevity rather than its origin. She stayed when others left, helping carry the series to its conclusion. That choice came with its own set of assumptions, some generous, others less so. In the public imagination, she was tied to the version of the show Jaclyn had rejected, a connection that subtly shaped how their relationship was remembered. What makes this chapter particularly poignant is how little either woman said during or immediately after the transition. There were no tell-all interviews, no attempts to correct the record, no effort to frame the story definitively. Silence remained the dominant language. In that silence, fans filled the gaps, often mistaking distance for hostility and professionalism for coldness. Time has a way of compressing stories, smoothing complexity into simpler narratives. Over the years, Jaclyn's departure and Ladd's continued presence became shorthand for opposing positions, even though the reality was far more layered. One woman left to preserve her principles, the other stayed to fulfill her commitment. Neither choice invalidated the other, yet the contrast invited judgment. By the end of the series, the unresolved space between Cheryl Ladd and Kate Jaclyn had become permanent, not because of active conflict, but because the moment for resolution had passed. What remained was memory, shaped by absence, defined by restraint, and carried forward by audiences who sensed that something meaningful had ended without ever being fully explained. Decades later, what people describe as Cheryl Ladd breaking her silence looks very different from the dramatic reckoning many expected. There was no explosive interview, no list of grievances, no attempt to reopen old chapters for attention. Instead, what emerged was something quieter and far more revealing, a willingness to acknowledge the past without reshaping it. When Ladd reflected on her time working with Kate Jaclyn, she chose restraint over spectacle, saying that Jaclyn was never all that friendly was not meant to provoke. It was a careful acknowledgement of reality. In a single sentence, she confirmed what had long been sensed but never articulated, that warmth never developed and closeness was never part of their shared experience. She did not assign blame or revisit old tension. She simply stated what had been. Calling it a broken silence implies a reckoning that never came. What Ladd offered was reflection rather than confrontation. She did not revisit old tension or dramatize the past, choosing clarity over spectacle and revealing a relationship defined less by conflict than by an absence of connection. That distinction matters, especially given the expectations placed on women who carried the weight of cultural icons. For decades, audiences waited for a decisive explanation, a clear villain, or a moment of emotional release that would justify years of speculation. Ladd declined that framing. Her words suggested acceptance rather than resentment, understanding rather than accusation. Time has softened the edges of Charlie's Angels, turning a working television series into a nostalgic artifact. Reruns, retrospectives, and documentaries have preserved the show in memory, but memory often simplifies what was once complicated. In that process, distance becomes labeled as feud, and restraint is mistaken for hostility. Ladd's reflections resist that simplification, grounding the story in emotional realism. Kate Jackson never publicly reframed the relationship either. Her comments about the show remained focused on creative dissatisfaction rather than personal grievance. That consistency reinforces the idea that her frustrations were rooted in direction and control, not personal animosity. Ladd's later acknowledgement aligns with that understanding, suggesting parallel experiences rather than opposing sides. What remains when the speculation is stripped away is a story shaped by timing and misalignment. Two women stood on the same set at different emotional moments in their careers, carrying different expectations for what the work should be. Neither adjusted fully to the other, and the distance that formed never found resolution. In the end, Ladd's words do not rewrite history. They settle it. They confirm that the separation was real, that it endured, and that it does not need embellishment. Some stories do not end with reconciliation or confrontation. They end with clarity, and sometimes that quiet truth is enough. In the end, the story of Cheryl Ladd and Kate Jackson is not one of explosive fallout or public betrayal. It is a reminder that even the most iconic images are shaped by human complexity. Charlie's Angels promised unity, confidence, and shared purpose. Yet behind that promise were two women navigating change, expectation, and emotional distance in very different ways. What time has revealed is not a feud fueled by anger, but a relationship defined by restraint. Neither woman chose spectacle. Neither turned private discomfort into public theater. That choice allowed the show to endure, even if it left questions unanswered for decades. Perhaps that is why this story still resonates. It speaks to moments that never found resolution, to silences that linger long after the spotlight fades. And sometimes, understanding does not arrive through confrontation, but through the quiet acceptance of what simply was. For more emotional stories, check out this video.